Now, this video here is going to be my reaction to Bernie Sanders' appearance on Joe Rogan, specifically the segment in which they talked about drug policy and drug addiction and whatnot. I will link that specific clip in the description of this video, and I would suggest that you guys watch it before watching the rest of this. I don't have time today to go bounce back and forth between the interview and make like a fancy, proper reaction video. So yeah, these are just my thoughts as I'm taking a walk. But nonetheless, if you want to dislike this video because you don't agree with some of the undertones, go ahead. We can talk about politics in the comment section. I'm not trying to get too political. I'm not trying to shove my beliefs down anyone's throat. I'm just, rambling my first thoughts of what Bernie said. So first, just to get it out of the way, yeah, it is good to see Bernie Sanders, admitting that laws against marijuana are silly and outdated, and that having marijuana scheduled in the same way as heroin is absurd. So yes, just if we look at Bernie Sanders' agenda to federally legalize marijuana, I think all of us can get behind that. A lot of people are going to say that Bernie Sanders isn't a typical politician because he isn't corrupt, he isn't wealthy, he has a consistent voting record. There's a lot of arguments for why Bernie isn't a typical politician, and a lot of these are valid. But in my eyes, one of the things that does make him a typical politician is that he's very good at not directly answering difficult questions. He's very good at just knowing how to dodge tricky questions and still respond to them in a way that doesn't obviously look weak. Joe asked him a question, basically saying American drug demand causes all of this violence in Mexico and Latin America, and if we legalize drugs, wouldn't that reduce the amount of violence and corruption and financial issues on a global level as well? So kind of from a utilitarian, humanitarian aspect, legalizing drugs in America could have a net positive effect on this region of the world. So wouldn't Bernie sympathize with that kind of a position? And Bernie, I don't think he had an answer prepared for that kind of question, because he said to Joe, so what you're really asking is, what's the cause of the opioid epidemic in America? And that's only slightly similar to Joe's question. Joe kind of, talked about an American drug demand, and then Bernie went on to answer this question about what he believed to be the cause of the opioid epidemic. Obviously, he had an answer prepared for this question. So he responded to Joe's question by asking a different question, one that he had a well-spoken answer prepared for. And I just see this as, that's sneaky. I want to hear him try and actually answer Joe's question, because Joe's question is the one that we're all asking. We all want to know why these politicians can't see what we see, which is basically legalizing drugs in America, it is going to be it's going to reduce violence and corruption and everything, or at least it could. So why can't we consider it from that angle as well? What I did like Sanders saying was he's very open about his interpretation of the drug situation in America as one where we are better off fighting the demand than the supply. So many politicians for decades and decades now are all about fight the supply, fight the supply, fight the supply. How are we going to fight the supply? Well, it's just basic economics. As long as there's a demand for something, a supply will rise up to meet that demand. So yes, so focusing on the demand for drugs is the better approach. So it's good to hear him say that. And also talking about I think he called it, not his original term, but he called drug addiction a disease of despair. And yes, I wholeheartedly agree with this. I do think that drug addiction is a disease of despair. Despair is a perfect word for it. Now, and I think we can even go further than the proverbial, small town in West Virginia being full of despair. I think despair is something that doesn't really discriminate. Despair hits people in all walks of life, rich, poor, urban, rural, young, old. You can feel despair from not having any job prospects, but you can also feel despair, sitting in your mansion, yet experiencing existential and nihilistic pain about life being meaningless. despair is one of the big drivers for why people do drugs. I mean, I felt despair throughout my life for various reasons, and yes, it's not the only reason I did drugs. Like, answering the question of like, why did I do drugs, why did I fall into drug addiction, that's a very complicated answer, with multiple ways that I could take it, and we'll do that in another video. But yes, like, seeing and recognizing drug addiction as something that is a fight against disparity in this country, and making people feel like they actually have meaning and purpose on any level, a job level or a, deep existential level. Yes, that is a good starting point for reducing it. You'll notice that there was one situation where Joe Rogan asked Bernie Sanders. He asked him, he said, I can't remember exactly how it played out, but he said, so you don't think that all drugs should become legal? And then he immediately said, or decriminalized. And Bernie Sanders answered, no, not at this time. So Joe said, so you don't think drugs should be fully legalized or decriminalized? And Bernie Sanders said, no, not at this time. Now, perhaps Bernie answered prematurely. He only answered in response to Joe saying legalized. But if Bernie Sanders actually doesn't want drugs to become decriminalized, or certain drugs, said in another way, if Bernie Sanders thinks that certain drugs should remain criminalized, then I question whether he's really, this progressive that everybody hails him up to be. I would think that someone who is truly progressive and wants to take the United States to a place where other countries are doing well around the world with drug policy, like, you gotta at least have blanket, full-scale decriminalization. If Bernie's so adamant about reducing the prison population from nonviolent drug crimes, then don't tell me that you don't want to make all drugs decriminalized. That's just, like, I was caught off guard when I heard him say that. But again, he may have only answered to the legalization part. We don't really know. So Bernie Sanders is going to say that healthcare is a universal human right, a basic human right, whatever. And I have said on this channel, but just in life a lot, that I think drug use, just strictly the concept of putting drugs into one's own body, is also a human right, meaning that locking someone up just for doing drugs is a violation of human rights. This is something I believe in. Now, where things are going to get tricky, though, is when you have someone like Sanders who has a some type of socialized healthcare plan. Then anytime anytime a state is going to have some type of socialized healthcare, they're going to be prone to being very paternalistic when it comes to drugs. And I mean, that kind of makes sense, because if all of society is absorbing the costs of hospital visits and health consequences and everything, then yes, society will absorb the costs of things going wrong with using drugs. And a lot of people don't like that. It turns them the wrong way. We all know of a guy who's going to be like, yeah, I don't want to pay for so-and-so doing drugs and overdosing and his ambulance fees and hospital fees. So people don't think they have a right to pay for that. Again, that's why a socialized healthcare system is going to be very paternalistic on drugs. And I think this is ultimately why Sanders is hesitant to argue for things like heroin or cocaine being legal, because of this fact that people don't want to pay for the consequences of other people's drug addiction. Now, again, like, where it becomes hypocritical, and people always draw the parallel between drug addiction and obesity as food addiction. So yeah, like in a socialized healthcare system, you are obviously paying for the consequences of people overeating themselves as well, which is a huge burden. And I mean, society in a way tries to legislate against obesity with like sin taxes on alcohol and whatnot, but it's much harder to legislate obesity out of a society than it is drug use. Now, you could imagine a scenario where, like, say hypothetically speaking, every person in the country went to a doctor, and the doctor gave the person a physical and looked at their individual metabolism and whatnot, and gave every person like a caloric cap, and it became illegal to eat above your caloric cap. So if I go to my doctor and he says you're not allowed to eat any more than 3,500 calories a day or you're going to become obese, it then becomes illegal for me to do so. Now, I think that if this kind of thing actually played out, people would start screaming left and right that it's a violation of human rights, that you can't tell people they're not allowed to eat a certain amount of food. It just, it rubs people wrong to try and do that. However, that right there is no different than telling people they can't do drugs or do certain drugs. If we're looking at the society absorbing the costs of the consequences of doing drugs. So no, it's not inconsistent. It's not inconsistent for someone to say that healthcare is a human right, but using certain drugs is not a human right. Those two things are not inconsistent, but it just gets very difficult when people then wouldn't want to take the same positions in a hypothetical situation where you would be legislating against obesity and food addiction.